On today's World Insight, legacy of 2020, bringing in 2021 with sobriety, make sense of 2021 holdover uncertainty in tonight's series, Geopolitical Hotspots and Security Issues.
Continuity should be the key word of 2021 versus 2020.
Trust, notably absent in China-U.S. ties under Trump. Can the two sides rebuild trust after Biden takes office?
We do have felt such kind of very painful atmosphere, very polluted political atmosphere in Washington.
And frosty China-U.S. military relations. Is there any way the two sides can smoke the peace pipe?
Playing games with military is very dangerous.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The COVID-19 pandemic poses momentum changes to the global economy and society alike. Alongside the pandemic, the world is undergoing political and climatic changes, making 2021 full of uncertainties. Collaboration across different cultures, governments, and countries are more crucial than ever. In today's episode of our series 2021, Geopolitical Hotspots and Security Issues, I talked to Yuan Peng, president of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, who shared his analysis on the major issues we might encounter this year and how to cope with them from the Chinese perspective. Take a listen.
Big change in their cooperation.
For me, I think there are two parts.
At least the two sides still
That's a great achievement. Bilateral relationship with
2020 has been a turbulent year. What do you think are some of the major issues that could provide us with some inspiration about how we face up to the challenges of 2021?
I don't see some big change between 2021 to 2020. Continuity should be the key word of 2021 versus 2020. Because, for example, the COVID-19, still some countries in the second wave, some other countries still endured the first wave. We don't see any positive outcome in the near future. Some experts told us that maybe last an additional year. And how to live with COVID-19 is not a near-term task. So we do hope that Joe Biden can play a leading role in combating the COVID-19 under WHO, with China, with other countries. Mm-hmm. So COVID-19 per se is not that serious, but if we have good cooperation among major powers, in particular the United States and China, I think we still have confidence to deter or combat the pandemic.
But many say what the pandemic did in the year 2020 is to exacerbate the already existing challenges, and in such a way that it is sometimes even beyond the interpretation. Now, should we be optimistic, more optimistic about that, even with the change of one person in the government in the U.S., or should we be more realistic, Professor?
I think realistic is the right word to describe the pandemic in 2021, because so far, even if we have a vaccine in many countries, but how is the effect still yet to prove. And we see some variables in the pandemic per se, for example, in Great Britain, in many other countries. And the most important is a political virus. So if a political virus accompanied with the real pandemic virus, is a real disaster. So in terms of political virus, I think maybe Joe Biden is much better than Donald Trump's administration. In this regard, we have a little bit hope. So how U.S. and China and other countries cooperate will be more decisive factor in determining the future of 2021.
During the time of the change of administration, many from this side, for example, Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi earlier proposed about pandemic prevention control, about climate change, as well as economic recovery as the common ground that the two sides, China-U.S., can work together. However, will this so-called working together have enough spillover effect to having a better understanding of the other side and probably better will of interacting with one another? It's a still question mark. What do you think, Professor?
His first task is combating the COVID-19. If Joe Biden do hope to win the combating COVID-19 task, he bound to find a new way to cooperate with China. This is not for U.S.-China relations. This is for his first year political career. In this regard, I think we still think that we have some minimum positive hope in the near future. But because of domestic political environment is so bad that I doubt Joe Biden has the capability to overcome all those political obstacles shaped by Donald Trump's administration. This is a big test for his political brief and political, tactic.
So what is going to be the nature of China-U.S. relations? That has been a debate for some time already. Many suggest that there's going to be containment and continued containment for years, if not decades, coming from the existing power toward a rising power. That's the argument. Professor Yuan, how do you see it from the Chinese perspective?
I think the U.S. and China relations has many scenarios in the future. No one can conclude in one final outcome. So today, China has some power to shape and to reset the relations. So how to mobilize our domestic factors, resources, how to use Chinese right strategy and policy to lead the relations also is a big test. Even if we are entering into a new phase of U.S.-China relations, which is so bad, but both sides has many rational scholars, experts, and political figures. They want a stable U.S. and China relations. Competition per se is not a bad word. We need a good competition. In those competitive areas, we need a good competition rather than better competition. In those cooperative areas, how can we seize the opportunity to make the cooperative areas as big as possible? In those very risky areas like South China Sea, Taiwan, sorts of things, how to prevent the risk from spiral out of control. So we have many lists of the work in the near future. That's why President Xi proposed a new model of U.S.-China relations. We need to jointly create a new model. This new model is not only good for U.S.-China, but will provide some case for the future international relations. I think we need this kind of creative thinking, like older generation person like Henry Kissinger said that we need co-evolution. Mm-hmm. If 97 years old Henry Kissinger has this very creative thinking, why not the new generations still living in the old thinking, like so-called new Cold War?
Because they would argue it's exactly because China has already become such a power that would challenge the United States, and therefore they will go to their last resort, which is to go into a mode of the Cold War, to shape China into that, and also have policies and partners as a result of that.
Yeah,
that will be their argument.
This is a very traditional, big power relations thinking. And this is based on GDP, based on national power, sorts of things. But GDP today is not a right standard to judge the big power relations. If no surprise, in 2028, 2030 something, Chinese overall economic, total economic GDP or power will surpass the States as the #1 in the world. But so what? So what? How about high tech? How about the military? How about the per capita GDP? How about the condition of people's daily life, sorts of things? So today we need some new standards to judge the relations. How about the digital? How about the cyber? How about deep sea? So many new areas. So both countries need to go beyond the traditional thinking and find some creative new thinking. This is the only way to drag the relations out of those traps to find a real new model.
You've been in your recent speeches and also recent articles talking about the dangers that China is facing, the world is facing. What do you consider as some of the other elements which you haven't touched on yet?
I think ideology is a very dangerous area because one thing is not that certain for Joe Biden's China policy is that the Democratic Party in the States always enjoy thinking about ideology as a tool in foreign affairs. For example, Joe Biden said that in the first year when he comes into power, he will have a global democracy summit sort of things. I think in 21st century still use the ideology as a tool to divide the world into two different camps is a wrong way. So if that's the case, I think make the situation even worse, even more complicated. Another areas I think is the so-called U.S., EU, Japan, the free trade areas. So how to find a new way between Western and Eastern countries, how to find a new way between U.S. and China, EU and China, rather than just U.S., EU, Japan, those developed economies. You will have a new regional arrangements, and the other side is China and the developing countries. So it's backward of the world trend. It's not a forward-looking. So in those areas, I think we need to have some early warning sorts of dialogue. Otherwise, the relations will go into even worse situation in the future.
China is changing so fast, and therefore people who are doing research about China's security and strategies need to have a ever-evolving grip of what's going on in this country and what is going to be its agenda. So how do you look at that as one of those complicated factors in your research and your future?
Originally, Chinese observers, when we research international relations, we just research on U.S., Russia, EU, major powers and regional powers. But China, we are just put China outside the box. Mm-hmm. Today, how to put China's factor into the international relations is something new for us. The biggest factor is the rise of China. So without understanding ourselves, how can we understand the world? How this change of China affect the world, and how to think about the response from outside the world for Chinese own change. This is a new challenge and a new tasks for we generation, because China now, we said that we are changing from rich to strong. Stronger China means we need a very comprehensive understanding of ourselves, rather than just pursue a strong economically China, but also a more benign and more attractive Chinese image and the Chinese new stage in the world.
You're watching World Insight. Coming up in the program, Trust was notably absent in China-U.S. ties under Trump. Can the two sides rebuild trust after Biden takes office? Answers from the Chinese scholar.
We do have felt such kind of very painful atmosphere, very polluted political atmosphere in Washington.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. 2021 will be a critical year for all of us, a test of our determination to deal with COVID-19 and overcome political and economic uncertainties. The element of trust, though, among all other factors, becomes essential in international relations. Despite tensions in 2020, how will China and the U.S. rebuild trust, to a certain extent at least, in the coming year? For answers, I talked to Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, who offered his insights on ways to rebuild China-U.S. ties. Take a listen.
Big change in their cooperation.
For me, I think it's a good path.
At least the two sides still
That's a great achievement.
Bilateral relationship with
Professor Chen, recently you have been intensively talking about the building of trust under a lot of circumstances. Tell me more about exactly what you meant.
I think that in terms of international relations, the elements of trust would serve as a kind of oxygen. Without the trust, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to have a basic interaction, let alone the cooperation.
Do you feel suffocating already right now?
I think that in terms of bilateral relationship with Washington, yes, we do have felt such kind of very painful atmosphere, very polluted political atmosphere in Washington.
So you talk about trust, but is trust a basic element of international relations? Some argue it is real national interests that are the deciding factor.
Well, you see, the world has changed greatly. We are still living in an increasingly interdependent and complex same system. This is the reality. And both the United States and China, they are the key anchors against those systematic risks or challenges or dangers, from the climate change to those pandemics, those extremism, terrorism, etc., as well as those disasters, catastrophic phenomena affecting the stability and the prosperity of the world. So these are the reality. And if both sides could not appreciate the strategic value of sides' special role playing in this world, I think that this is the basic elements of the trust.
Can China and U.S. still trust each other?
We are still in the process of rebuilding the trust. I would say we are in the process of rebuilding the rationale of bilateral relationship, that both sides should recognize that if both sides could not accept this strategic value of working together to help prevent those catastrophic, systematic risks of the world we are living in, then I think that will be a loss for all, for both. So this is the reality, and this is also the fundamental changing context in which we have to reconsider the value of the trust. And I think even if we are in the process of rebuilding the trust, it is still some of basic elements of trust between two sides. Economically speaking, I think that despite of so many harsh pressure from Washington in the past few years, our economic relationships are still there. In terms of those science, technology area, even if I think that we are faced an increasingly decoupling approach pursued by Washington. But I think that if you just check those cooperation in responding to the pandemic, the scientists, the doctors of both sides, they're also working quite closely, actually. So I think that those kind of a working relationship based upon trust are still there. Otherwise, I think there will be no possibility of working together at all.
Will a change of administration make a huge difference?
Well, I think Biden administration will be much more pragmatic in terms of dealing with China. Biden administration recognizes both sides are quite different. But so far, those key players, senior officials appointed by the president-elect of Biden, they try to rule out prospect of a Cold War with China. That's quite promising, actually, because this is what Beijing wants. We don't see that both sides actually are engaged in a kind of a Cold War scenario. And we also believe that despite of the differences, politically, ideologically, but the common, as I said, those common challenges facing us, their importance are much bigger than those of the differences in terms of those ideology. This is what I understand. So this is the reason why I believe that there are still some elements of the trust, and the Biden administration, as long as they can pursue those pragmatic approach to China, it is more likely that both sides can meet in between and rebuild those shared rationale or framework.
You talk about the shared rationale or shared framework, and shared probably narrative in a way. How much do you think efforts needs to be made from both sides, particularly at the very beginning of the changed administration? Now, there seems to be a phenomenon after talking to both sides through my program, that one side is always expect the other side to take the first few steps.
Well, there's a mindset. I agree with your observation. There's a mindset, there's a rhetoric in Washington, D.C. these days, arguing that now the ball is in the Beijing's court, and it is Beijing rather than Washington, D.C. to take some initiative, and arguing that actually nowadays the Biden administration has been constrained by many of the legacies of Trump administration, and also it argued that Biden administration are going to continue some of the tough policy against China, to use those tough policy as a leverage to shape or press Beijing to behave itself. So this kind of a rhetoric has reinforced a kind of perception in Washington, D.C. that now the ball is on Beijing's side. If we look back...
Beijing also think that the ball is in the court of Washington's side.
No, I think that Beijing are much more proactive.
Meaning?
Beijing believes that the ball is in the middle. Both sides should step up, should meet in the halfway. While on one side, I think that the incoming Biden administration, during this very sensitive transitional period, to keep some degree of caution is understandable. But domestic agenda should not be an excuse for preventing them to take a more proactive policy to engage with China. So I think that Beijing has made quite clearly that we are ready, and we are going to reactivate all kind of dialogues. And we also, I think, our senior officials have already offered a different kind of a to-do list. So whether Biden administration would be ready and be more proactive to engage with Beijing, that's very important. So I think that the ball is in the middle.
The ball is in the middle. The to-do list that you said that the Chinese sides are offering, climate change, pandemic cooperation, economic recovery. These are said by the Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi. So are these the basic points that China is proposing?
Yes, I think that that's a very important initiative. As I said, that these days, both sides should recognize or reassure each other's strategic value of cooperation. And those areas for cooperations all related to a systematic stability and prosperity. So whether both sides can work together, for instance, in terms of a vaccine production, distribution, to make the vaccine really a public good, not only to both countries, to peoples of both countries, but rather to those most vulnerable peoples around the world. Because the pandemic, the nature of pandemic means that if those most vulnerable parts could not be accessible to those vaccines, there will be no possibility to control the pandemic. So I think that this is
no one
the
is
responsibility.
safe until everyone is safe. Yeah.
So I think this is the key responsibility by the two stakeholders or anchors, as I said. Those anchors are against the systematic risks.
Professor Chen, in China, there's a lot of debate about what to do next regarding China-U.S. relations, regarding where China is going, what is China's agenda, what should be the nature of the goal of China's development. Of course, there's an official narrative. But from the academic perspective, what do you make of these decisions and others' perceptions about these decisions?
Well, I think that the pandemic has accelerated a lot of the pace, the tension, or the dynamic of the international relation. But it has not reversed or changed the fundamental course. Now, we have seen that on one side, we are all the beneficiary to some extent of this economic globalization. But on the other side, in terms of global governance system itself, I think that it is less capable of handling many of those shortcomings or weakness or the side effects of this economic integration or globalization. So I think that nowadays it's time for all those key players to really work together, to talk in a constructive but in a frank way, to share their compare notes about what is the real risk. Whether the real risk looming at large is the so-called ideological confrontation between the Beijing and Washington, or so-called China and those established powers. I think that we should rethink about our logic. And so this is the reason why, as in academic circle, it is very important to talk with our counterparts, particularly in the Western countries, to reconsider the so-called the narrative, because it helps shape the mindset, and also it helps shape the discourse as well as the agenda of the policy making.
Professor Chen, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight. Coming up in the program, China-U.S. military ties remained frosty throughout last year. Is there any way the two sides can pivot towards peace?
Playing games with military is very dangerous.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Eyeing China's rise as a global military power, the U.S. and its allies have rolled out new weapons and strategies in a bid to contain China's presence in the Asia-Pacific. At least that's believed by some. The U.S. in particular has unveiled a comprehensive defense policy against China on multiple fronts. At a time of huge uncertainty, though, how will China maintain regional peace while security threats loom in 2021? And how will the militaries, both from China and the U.S., be the stabilizing factor of this uncertain bilateral relations? For answers, I talked to Xu Hui, Dean of the International College of Defense Studies from National Defense University of China. Let's take a listen.
Big change in their cooperation.
For me, I think it's a good path.
At least the two sides still
That's a great achievement.
Bilateral relationship with
Professor, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
At a time of huge uncertainty, many are thinking about the year 2021. How do you look at the security situation China is facing right now? What does it mean for your field?
It's really hard to predict what will happen in the future.
But what I want to emphasize that actually we have a lot of certainties. And the most important certainty was provided by China. And China will focus on the development. And in the past 4 decades, China's development actually not only make their own people live a better life and also play a very positive role, a leading role in the whole East Asia and make East Asia unprecedentedly peace and prosperous in history. Maybe 1,000 years of history, I can say, at least since the Opium Wars up to now. The first time the whole area enjoyed the peace and prosperity for almost 4 decades. That's a great achievement in the humankind. And with the initiative of B&I, and this model of development for peace will expand to the big area of the world. So I can say with the frustration of the theory of the end of history or democracy for peace, China actually developed a role, I call it development for peace, and will play a bigger and bigger role and provide more certainties to the people around the world. And we have to say that most of the people, more and more people around the world recognize the importance of peace and share the future of humankind. This notion also widely accepted by the people in the world. Even the Americans, I think, if the new administration comes into power, they will also focus on their internal issues. For instance, the divide of ethnic groups, and the most important thing is the economy, recovery of the economy. So if they want to recover the economy, they also have to focus on development. And I think all of the world, they will focus on development, and they will join hands to work together.
If you look around what is really happening, pandemic, unilateralism, and geopolitics, and divide within societies, Professor Xu, are you too optimistic when you are talking about the pretext?
Yeah, you're right. I say the main theme will remain as the peace and development. Doesn't mean there will be no chaos, no turbulence. And the conflicts and crises abound and will continue in some of the Middle East areas, even bigger areas, and even around China, the 4 seas, East, North Sea, East Sea, South Sea, and also across the strait, will still have a lot of problems. Yeah. But they will not, I think they will not become the main theme of the world.
How is China preparing for these vulnerabilities?
China's, in our mind, we still believes that we have the opportunity, to develop our economy, and we also, with the development of our economy, our capabilities and strength for maintaining peace, especially in the region, I think it's getting stronger. And with the determination of play a more positive role, even as a stabilizer, I think China will do whatever we can. For instance, expand cooperation in different areas with other countries, and also we have to modernize our military. And because only when you're prepared for the unexpected war, you can convince the possible aggressors to disturb peace. And also China will provide more public security goods, not only the vaccines against the COVID-19, and also other type of public goods like peacekeeping and maintaining the maritime security, and we determined to do that.
Is China already participating in some kind of arms race?
I don't think so.
When you're talking about Chinese military further building up?
It's not necessary. China's policy of defense, we call it active defense rather than preemptive defense. Defense means we are not invade other countries. From professional military point of view, if you have a defensive position, you don't need to have equalize the strength of your military with others, or you don't have to outweigh the other countries. The purpose is to prevent the others to invade you. So not necessary to spend too much on that.
What about South China Sea?
South China Sea actually not a very serious issue, but unfortunately it was politicized and dramatized. Since the introduction of the 1982 Maritime Convention. Actually, more than half of the maritime territories and maritime rights have not been settled around the world. And South China Sea, just one of them, and see the Mediterranean seas, seas Baltic seas, and even you look around the Latin America in the Caribbean seas, and even between America and Canada, they have a lot of issues have not been resolved yet. But since Americans have the biggest say in the world, have a larger voice, so they continue to trumpet the South China Sea issue, so make it sounds like South China Sea is one of the most dangerous area.
You don't think so?
Actually, it's not true. Yes.
What about the Taiwan Straits? Now, with the change of administration, many say there were vulnerabilities. How is the Chinese military, from your perspective, is preparing for all options? I remember the spokesperson from the Chinese military have been talking about preparing for all options.
Yes, if you compare today's Chinese military capabilities with the 1996 crisis, we can simply conclude that the strength of deterring any suppression, any provocation by the Taiwan independent forces, was strengthened. I think we have the advantage. We have the confidence and determination and capabilities to deter any type of aggression. Yeah. And I think with that in mind, we will be confident to maintain regional peace. And at the same time, we will do whatever we can to strengthen the cooperation across the strait. And gradually, I think the regional countries and even the international community will fully understand China's goodwill intentions of maintaining regional peace.
The other thing is about China-U.S. relations. The military ties were not necessarily one of those stabilizing factors between the two countries earlier. However, with the other aspects of the relations becoming ever more vulnerable, the military ties seems to be a stabilizing factor of somewhat certainty between the two countries. What is the nature of this relation between the two militaries right now?
Yeah. Military actually should be the last resort for defending national interests and world peace by any country, according to the UN Charter. Unfortunately, the Americans took military as the standard policy option for maintaining their interest. So they involved in so many kills, conflicts for the last several decades, and that made American the most warlike state, as Jimmy Carter said. But by the end of the day, they find out they suffered rather than gained from the military operations. Only a group of people, maybe they get benefited, that is the military industry complex. And the whole American people, especially the middle class, they suffered greatly, because the government spent money not for, to improve their living standard, rather they spend money for fighting. And only those behind the fighting benefit. So military is not a good option to resolve, disputes. Yeah. Face-to-face with China, U.S.-China militaries, all we know, both are nuclear powers. The nuclear war will be no better, no party will benefit from that. I think the American decision makers should fully understand about that. But they're still playing some games with the military as a tool to force China to concede in some other areas. So I see the Americans' military operations in this area is very provocative, and they also take it as a tool for crisis management, to gain more interest. Yeah, I believe their focus should be and will be economy. Sullivan, said in the paper, they want to find a way for competition without catastrophe. That catastrophe, I think, is a war between superpowers.
So there is room to improve?
Up to now, I think both militaries maintain a stable and dialogue and communicate, and we have to play with the rules. They developed the rules for playing games by militaries in Chinese peripheral. I think with the capacity development of Chinese military and with more knowledge about the crisis management, and I think two sides will try their best to prevent crisis from escalating into conflict. But anyhow, we have to be prepared for the unexpected. Sometimes maybe lost control. So playing games with military is very dangerous. So my advice is reduce that military operations in other countries' doorstep. That will be of the interest of Americans.
Thank you so much, Professor Yu, as always.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today's 2021 Geopolitical Hotspots and Security Issues. Tomorrow we'll have another episode of interviews on China-U.S. ties, China-Indian relations, as well as relations across the Taiwan Strait. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.